Avoiding eye contact is often easier than risking recognition. Evan Holloway learned that lesson early, and he practiced it like a quiet discipline. He sat at the long wooden table in the cafe, with his shoulders slightly hunched, eyes trained on the rim of his coffee cup, as if it held answers he wasn't ready to read. The place was warm and crowded, the kind of neighborhood cafe that forced strangers into proximity. But Evan treated closeness like weather, something to endure without reacting. Since his wife's death and the slow drift of friends who didn't know how to stay, he had learned that looking up invited questions. Questions invited stories. Stories reopened doors he kept locked for his daughter's sake. The cafe had only shared tables left, which was how he ended up there in the first place. The room hummed with soft conversations and the scrape of chairs, but Evan felt exposed, like the quietest sound in the room. He angled his body inward, knees tucked, one hand resting protectively near his phone. Eye contact here meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant being seen. He had been seen once too often and misunderstood even more. It was easier to disappear in plain sight. Across from him, close enough to share the same light but far enough to pretend separation, sat a woman alone. Evan noticed her without lifting his gaze, registering presence the way one senses a shadow passing by. She hadn't spread out or claimed space. Her hand stayed folded around a mug she didn't drink from, eyes drifting to the window and back again, as if waiting for something that wasn't coming. There was a restraint in her posture that mirrored his own, a carefulness born from knowing how easily hope can betray you. Evan shifted, deliberately turning his chair a few degrees away. It was a small movement, but it felt necessary. Eye contact could turn coincidence into connection, and connection had a cost he wasn't sure he could pay. He had 2 daughters to raise, 2 lives that depended on his steadiness. Guarded wasn't just a mood anymore, it was a responsibility. Mila and Rowan, his twin girls, sat beside him with their hot chocolates cooling between them. They were 10, old enough to read rooms better than he realized, young enough to still believe that unspoken things mattered most. They watched people the way other children watched cartoons, their attention drawn to what wasn't said. Evan thought he was shielding them by staying quiet, by keeping his eyes down. But children were emotional gatekeepers in ways adults rarely acknowledged. The twins noticed the woman before Evan consciously allowed himself to. Mila's gaze flicked from her father's bowed head to the empty chair across the table, then to the woman's still hands. Rowan leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing in thoughtful curiosity rather than judgment. They felt the tension between nearness and distance, the strange ache of people sharing space without sharing presence. To them, it wasn't awkward, it was unfinished. Evan took a slow sip of coffee, pretending to be absorbed by the taste. He told himself the woman was just another stranger, that loneliness was common here, that he didn't owe anyone attention. Yet something in the air felt suspended, like a held breath. The cafe's warmth pressed in, amplifying the quiet pauses between sounds. He wondered, briefly and unwillingly, what story had led her to sit alone at a shared table, guarding herself with silence. The woman shifted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and Evan felt the instinct to look up, flare, and fade. He kept his eyes down, choosing safety over curiosity. He didn't see her glance in his direction, and then away, mirroring his restraint. 2 isolated orbits, close enough to feel gravity, too cautious to collide. Mila nudged Rowan under the table, a wordless exchange passing between them. They had grown up watching their father carry grief like a fragile thing, careful not to drop it, careful not to let it cut anyone else. They understood in their own way that he stayed when others left, that his constancy was born from loss. But they also sensed moments when staying still became another kind of leaving. The cafe door opened, letting in a rush of cold air and laughter, breaking the spell. Evan exhaled without realizing he'd been holding his breath. He glanced at his daughters, offering a small practiced smile meant to reassure them. They smiled back, but their eyes drifted again, drawn to the quiet woman, who seemed to exist in the same emotional space as their father, unchosen and unseen. Evan straightened his cup, aligning it with the table's edge, a habit that calmed him. He told himself this was enough. Warmth, coffee, his girls beside him. Yet the feeling lingered, an awareness he couldn't shake, like a story beginning just out of sight. He didn't know that the ones who loved him most had already noticed the table he was trying not to see. The twins notice what their father is. Trying not to see, distance can feel like discipline after enough disappointment. For Evan Holloway, distance wasn't an accident or a flaw he planned to fix someday. It was a system that had proven reliable when everything else failed. It had formed quietly after his wife died, and solidified through smaller losses that followed. Friends who stopped calling, relatives who spoke in careful tones before fading out, relationships that dissolved the moment his life seemed too complicated. Over time, disappointment taught him efficiency. He learned which parts of himself to keep accessible and which ones to close off, and he stopped questioning the logic behind it. Distance didn't promise happiness, but it delivered predictability, and predictability kept his world from collapsing. Single parenthood narrowed his emotional boundaries the way a long winter narrows a landscape. There was less room for indulgence, less space for wondering what might happen if he leaned in instead of away. Every decision had weight now, measured against school schedules, bedtime routines, and the quiet responsibility of being both anchor and shelter. Evan told himself that curiosity led to distraction, and distraction led to instability. He couldn't afford instability, not with 2 daughters watching how he stood upright in a life that had knocked him down once already. Neutrality became his refuge. If he expected nothing, he wouldn't be disappointed. If he offered little, he wouldn't lose much. He convinced himself this wasn't bitterness but wisdom, the kind earned through lived experience. Emotional restraint felt safer than hope, because hope demanded participation, and participation meant risking failure in front of the people who mattered most. So he moved through the world with polite distance, careful words, and an expression that suggested calm even when exhaustion sat heavy beneath it. That exhaustion wore the mask of control. Evan ran his days on routines sharp enough to cut through chaos, morning checklists, evening rituals, predictable weekends. He told himself structure was strength, that keeping everything in its place meant he was doing right by his girls. In truth, control helped him ignore how tired he was, how lonely the nights felt once the apartment went quiet. Fatigue didn't scare him as much as emotional hunger did, because hunger asked to be fed. He believed restraint protected Mila and Rowan. By staying reserved, by not letting new people too close, he thought he was sparing them confusion and loss. He had watched too many adults come and go from their lives, each departure leaving questions he struggled to answer. If he kept his distance, there would be fewer goodbyes to explain. In his mind, love expressed through consistency was safer than love expressed through vulnerability. What Evan didn't fully see was how closely his daughter studied the spaces he avoided. Children, after all, learn empathy not just from what is offered, but from what is withheld. Mila noticed how her father's voice softened when he spoke about the past, but never lingered there. Rowan observed how he deflected personal questions with humor or silence. They didn't interpret this as strength alone. They read it as caution shaped by hurt. Watching him taught them that emotions weren't dangerous, but they were delicate, deserving care rather than denial. At the cafe, Evan maintained his practiced distance, unaware of how the moment was being rewritten through his daughter's eyes. He believed he was simply minding his own business, modeling self-control in a public place. The twins, however, saw a man choosing safety over connection, and they wondered why someone who stayed so faithfully for them seemed unwilling to be chosen by the world around him. They felt the quiet pull of another lonely presence nearby, and sensed an unspoken question hovering between tables. Mila leaned slightly toward her sister, whispering observations that carried more insight than judgment. Rowan listened, her gaze thoughtful, piecing together what adults often miss. They didn't see danger in the unfamiliar or weakness in openness. To them, kindness wasn't something earned through time. It was something offered because someone needed it. Where Evan saw boundaries, they saw bridges waiting to be built. Evan adjusted his posture again, a small act of withdrawal he barely registered. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that keeping emotional distance had kept their lives intact this long. Yet a faint unease settled in his chest, a sense that his certainty was being quietly challenged. He didn't know that his daughters were forming their own conclusions, ones that didn't align with his careful logic. Distance had kept Evan standing when others might have fallen, but it had also kept him alone in ways he no longer examined. As the cafe's low hum continued around them, the twins exchanged another knowing glance, already interpreting the situation through a lens shaped by empathy rather than fear. The twins interpret the situation differently than he does. Children often understand emotional tension before adults admit it exists. Mila and Rowan didn't need words to sense that something quiet and fragile sat between their table and the one nearby. They noticed it the way some people notice a change in weather, subtle but unmistakable. Their father's shoulders were slightly tighter than usual. His attention focused downward with a determination that felt deliberate rather than casual. Across the shared space, the woman sat still, her posture composed but guarded, as if she were holding herself together with care. The silence between the tables wasn't empty, it was full of things left unsaid. The twins had learned to read posture the way other children read faces. They saw how the woman's eyes lifted briefly and then fell back to her cup, how her fingers traced the edge of the mug without ever lifting it. They caught the pauses, the almost glances, the way adults sometimes hover on the edge of connection and then retreat. To Mila, it felt like standing in a doorway no one wanted to cross first. To Rowan, it felt like a question waiting for permission to be asked. They noticed her isolation not as a fact but as a feeling. She wasn't dramatic about it, wasn't visibly sad or seeking attention, which made it stand out more. Loneliness, the twins had learned, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sat quietly, hoping not to be a burden. They had seen that same quiet loneliness in their father late at night when he thought they were asleep, and the recognition made something settle into place for them. Where adults hesitated, the twins leaned in emotionally. They hadn't yet learned to be embarrassed by kindness or to rank people by status or circumstance. To them, everyone at the table was just a person sharing the same air and warmth. They didn't weigh consequences the way Evan did. They weighed feelings. And the feeling here was clear. Two people choosing distance for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. Evan felt the moment tightening and responded the only way he knew how. He stayed uninvolved. He adjusted his chair, lowered his gaze, and gave his daughters a look that silently reminded them to behave, to stay close, to keep to themselves. He believed he was guiding them, teaching respect for boundaries. He didn't realize that from their perspective, the boundary looked less like respect and more like fear. Mila glanced at Rowan, her eyes asking a question without sound. Rowan answered with the smallest nod, a shared understanding passing between them. They didn't discuss it aloud, didn't need to. Growing up with a father who carried both strength and sorrow had made them attentive to emotional gaps. They understood that sometimes staying meant stepping forward, not back. Their agreement wasn't about fixing anything. It wasn't about forcing conversation or making anyone uncomfortable. It was about acknowledging presence, about letting someone know they were seen. The twins believed that small acts mattered, that kindness didn't require permission or explanation. In their world, being chosen, even briefly, could change how a day felt. Evan sensed movement beside him and tensed slightly, his instincts flaring. He was used to managing situations before they unfolded, used to preventing rather than reacting. He cleared his throat softly, a subtle signal meant to keep things as they were. The twins noticed, of course, they always did. But this time, they interpreted his caution differently. To them it wasn't a rule, it was uncertainty. Rowan picked up her hot chocolate, cradling it carefully, and Mila slid her chair back just enough to create space. Their movements were unhurried, respectful, but purposeful. Evan watched from the corner of his eye, a quiet unease rising in his chest. He told himself they were just restless, that nothing would come of it. Still, something about their calm confidence unsettled him more than outright mischief would have. The woman at the nearby table noticed too. She looked up as the chairs shifted, surprise flickering across her face before settling into cautious curiosity. For a moment, all three tables existed in a fragile balance, held together by the simple fact that children had decided silence wasn't the final answer. Evan remained still, caught between stepping in and stepping back. He had spent years teaching himself that staying uninvolved was safer, but watching his daughters now, he felt the first crack in that certainty. They weren't reckless, they weren't naive. They were attentive in a way he had forgotten how to be. The cafe's hum continued, unaware of the quiet turning point forming within it. Mila and Rowan exchanged one last glance, their decision solidified not by impulse but by empathy learned through watching others hurt and heal. They pushed their chairs back fully now, standing together, ready to cross the small distance their father had been avoiding. The twins decided to intervene. Sometimes kindness physically moves people out of hiding. Mila didn't announce anything. She simply placed her small hand on Evan's forearm with a gentleness that made resistance feel unnecessary. Rowan followed, standing close on his other side, their presence forming a quiet but unmistakable intention. Evan felt the shift before he understood it, the subtle pressure of being guided rather than asked. They weren't forcing him forward, they were inviting him to stop retreating. The movement was slow, almost ceremonial, as if they were careful not to startle the moment itself. His chair scraped softly against the floor as the twins nudged it back, creating a line of sight he had worked hard to avoid. Evan's first instinct was to correct them, to pull back into the familiar safety of stillness. But something in their calm stopped him. This wasn't mischief or defiance. It was trust. Trust that he could handle being seen, even if only for a second. Across the table, the woman looked up in clear surprise. Not the defensive kind, but the kind that comes when someone realizes they've been noticed after expecting invisibility. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, her posture straightening as if she were recalibrating her place in the room. She hadn't been prepared for acknowledgement, and the honesty of her reaction made the moment feel unguarded rather than awkward. The twins didn't speak right away. They didn't introduce their father or explain themselves. They simply stood there, present, allowing space for whatever might happen next. There was no expectation layered into their action, no demand for conversation or response. Their kindness carried no agenda, and that absence made it powerful. Evan felt it sharply, the difference between being pushed and being supported. As he finally lifted his eyes, vulnerability rushed in where control used to sit. He felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the cafe or the people around them. It was the exposure of stepping into a moment without a script, without the protection of distance. His carefully maintained neutrality slipped, replaced by the unfamiliar sensation of being open to outcome. The emotional space between the tables began to close, not through words, but through shared awareness. Evan noticed the woman's hands relax around her mug, the tension easing from her shoulders as she adjusted to the connection, rather than withdrawing from it. He recognized the same guarded relief he'd felt countless times when someone stayed instead of leaving. It startled him to see it mirrored back. Awkwardness hovered briefly, then softened. It transformed into something gentler, something like possibility. The cafe noise faded into the background, replaced by the quiet significance of the moment. Evan became acutely aware of his daughters standing beside him, their belief in him unwavering. They weren't embarrassed by him. They weren't worried about what might happen. They believed this was how things were supposed to work, that people reached toward each other when the distance became too heavy. He cleared his throat, not to break the moment, but to ground himself. For years he had equated restraint with protection. But standing there now, he felt the limits of that belief. Control had kept him functional, but it hadn't kept him whole. The twins had seen that long before he did. And their action wasn't a challenge to his authority. It was an extension of his values, reflected back with clarity. The woman's gaze shifted from the girls to Evan, tentative but steady. There was no judgment in her eyes, no impatience, just curiosity mixed with something softer, something that recognized effort. She didn't rush to fill the silence, and that restraint felt like respect rather than avoidance. It gave Evan room to breathe, to exist in the moment without needing to perform or retreat. He felt a quiet gratitude rise in him, unexpected and almost overwhelming, not just toward the woman, but toward his daughters, who had learned compassion by watching him endure and still choose to stay. In guiding him forward, they weren't undoing his resilience. They were building on it, showing him that staying didn't always mean standing still. The cafe seemed warmer now, the shared table less like a boundary and more like a meeting point. Evan realized that this moment, however small, carried the potential for something different. Not a solution, not a promise, but a beginning shaped by choice rather than fear. The woman looks up instead of away. Shared vulnerability softens fear faster than confidence ever could. Her name was Clara, though no one in the cafe knew it yet, and she had grown used to existing without being noticed. Not in a dramatic way, not with bitterness sharp enough to spill outward, but in the quiet, numbing way that came from being passed over too many times. She had learned how to sit without taking space, how to keep her expressions neutral so no one felt obligated to ask questions. Invisibility, she told herself, was easier than rejection. You company. Wouldn't lose what was never offered. Being ignored had become familiar long before that afternoon. Clara had spent years in rooms where conversations moved around her, instead of through her, where her presence was acknowledged only when necessary. She had been the dependable one, the one who listened, the one who stayed when others left, and somehow that reliability made her blend into the background. Over time, she stopped expecting to be chosen. Expectation, after all, carried the risk of disappointment, and disappointment had taught her how to be careful. So when she felt the shift at the shared table, the sudden awareness of being seen, it unsettled her more than she expected. She had looked up out of instinct, prepared to look away just as quickly, but instead, she met eyes that held uncertainty rather than judgment. There was no appraisal in Evan's expression, no quick assessment of worth or value, just a man caught in the same exposed moment she was, unsure of what came next. That absence of judgment changed everything. Clara felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly, replaced by a cautious warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She realized she wasn't being acknowledged out of obligation or politeness, but because two children had noticed her humanity and refused to let it go unrecognized. The simplicity of that recognition made her throat tighten. It had been so long since kindness arrived without conditions. The guarded silence that had wrapped the table began to soften. It didn't disappear all at once, but it thinned, making room for something gentler. Clara adjusted her grip on the mug, noticing her hands no longer trembled. The cafe felt less like a place he was passing through and more like somewhere she belonged, if only for this moment. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't need to. Being acknowledged was enough. Evan felt his own discomfort rise alongside an unexpected sense of relief. Looking at Clara, really looking at her, forced him to confront the cost of the distance he had built so carefully. He felt exposed not because he was weak, but because he was present. The relief surprised him most. It felt like setting down a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying, even if just for a breath. He noticed details he would have missed before. The tired kindness in her eyes, the way she held herself as if bracing for dismissal. He recognized it because it mirrored his own. For years he had believed restraint protected him and his daughters, but standing there now, he felt how isolating that belief had become. The discomfort of connection was real, but so was the relief of not being alone in it. Trust didn't announce itself. It began quietly, in the shared understanding that neither of them needed to perform. Clara didn't feel pressure to be interesting or agreeable. Evan didn't feel the need to be composed or distant. The twins remained beside him, their presence steady, as if they were anchoring the moment rather than directing it. They had opened a door, not pushed anyone through it. Clara glanced at the girls, offering a small smile that carried gratitude rather than expectation. In that exchange, something shifted further. She wasn't just being noticed by an adult who might look away at any moment. She was being chosen, however briefly, by people who believed connection was worth the risk. The loneliness she carried didn't vanish, but it loosened its grip, making space for the possibility of something more. Evan felt a quiet resolve forming, not loud or dramatic, but steady. Staying had always been his strength, but he was beginning to understand that staying also meant allowing himself to be present when moments asked for it. Control had helped him survive, but this felt like the beginning of something closer to living. He didn't know where the moment would lead, and for once he didn't feel the need to know. The air between them grew heavier, not with tension, but with meaning. It felt like a pause the world was holding, waiting to see what choice would be made next. The moment grows heavier with meaning. Connection often rearranges space before it rearranges lives. No one suggested moving chairs, yet the space between the tables softened as if it were listening. What had once felt like a clear divide, his side and hers, family and stranger, began to blur through small, unremarkable shifts. Mila pulled her chair a little closer without scraping the floor. Rowan leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table with relaxed familiarity. Clara didn't move her seat at all, but her posture changed, her shoulders easing as though the room itself had grown less demanding. The emotional tension that once pressed down on the moment slowly dissolved into something resembling comfort. Silence no longer felt like a test to endure, but a pause that belonged to everyone equally. Evan noticed his breathing settle, the tight vigilance he carried loosening its grip. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he wasn't monitoring the moment for risk. he was simply in it. The twins became bridges without trying to be. They asked Clara simple questions, not the kind meant to extract a story or justify her presence, but the kind children ask when curiosity is free of suspicion. Did she like the café? Was the drink too hot? Did she come here often or just sometimes? Their voices carried an ease that made inclusion feel natural rather than granted. They didn't see her as someone entering their space. They treated her as someone who had always been there. Clara felt the shift immediately. Being included without explanation or evaluation unsettled her in the best possible way. She answered carefully at first, then more freely, surprised by how safe the moment felt. There was no need to prove she belonged. The girls had already decided she did. That certainty wrapped around her gently, dissolving the habit of bracing for dismissal. For once, she wasn't waiting for the moment to end. Evan watched this unfold with a mixture of awe and quiet reckoning. Emotional safety, he realized, wasn't the absence of risk the way he had defined it for years. It wasn't about keeping the world at a controlled distance. It was about allowing moments to breathe without immediately containing them. Seeing his daughters navigate connection with such clarity challenged his old definitions, not through argument, but through example. He noticed how Clara listened as much as she spoke, how she met the girls' openness with respect rather than indulgence. There was no performance in her responses, no attempt to impress or ingratiate. That steadiness resonated with him. It felt familiar in a way that surprised him, as though they shared an understanding shaped by staying when it would have been easier to leave. Healing didn't announce itself with promises or declarations. It unfolded quietly, in the way Evan found himself responding instead of retreating, in the way Clara stopped scanning for exits. No one spoke about the future or named what this moment could mean. There were no assurances offered, no expectations set. That restraint made the connection feel honest rather than fragile. The cafe noise returned to Evan's awareness, but it no longer felt intrusive. It felt like life continuing around a pocket of something real. Isolation, which had once sat between them like a solid object, loosened its grip. It didn't disappear entirely, but it shifted from center stage to the edges, no longer dictating every movement or thought. Clara laughed softly at something Rowan said, the sound surprising even herself. It felt unfamiliar, like a part of her she hadn't used in a while stretching back into place. Evan caught the sound and felt something warm and unexpected stir in him, not attraction in the way he had learned to distrust, but recognition. The recognition of someone choosing to stay present without demanding anything in return. For a moment the shared table truly felt shared. Not claimed, not divided, but held together by mutual attention. Evan understood then that found family didn't begin with declarations or labels. It began with small decisions to remain open, to stay when silence could have been easier, to choose connection without knowing where it would lead. Yet even as the comfort settled, a subtle tension crept back in, quiet but insistent. Evan glanced toward the cafe door, toward the clock on the wall. Responsibilities waited. Time always did. The world outside this moment hadn't paused just because something meaningful was happening inside it. He felt the familiar pull of routine, the voice that reminded him moments like this were temporary. Clara sensed it too, the shift in the air, the way reality has a habit of reclaiming space just when hope begins to feel solid. She straightened slightly, not withdrawing but preparing. Experience had taught her that closeness often came with an expiration she never controlled. The warmth remained, but it trembled, as if tested by the question of what came next. Reality threatens to pull them back into distance. Fear returns. The moment connection feels real. Evan fell. At the instant the warmth settled too comfortably, like a reflex that had never truly left him. The fear didn't arrive loudly or dramatically. It slipped in quietly, dressed as reason. This was how it always began, with a moment that felt meaningful enough to lose. His mind replayed old endings without invitation, reminding him how easily hope could turn into disappointment. Connection, once it crossed a certain threshold, had a way of demanding more than he believed he could give. He told himself it was responsibility talking. He had felt this before, the instinct to step back just when something started to matter. He thought of past attempts at closeness that ended not in anger but in slow withdrawal, in people realizing his life was heavier than they expected. He had survived those moments by retreating early, by choosing distance before it could be chosen for him. The habit rose now, urging him to protect what little balance he had built. Across the table, Clara felt her own uneasy surface. She had learned to be cautious with kindness, especially the kind that arrived without explanation. Moments like this had misled her before, had tempted her to believe she was finally being seen, only to reveal later that she had read too much into ordinary decency. She watched Evan closely, noting the slight change in his posture, the way his attention flickered inward. She wondered if she had imagined the closeness, if this was the point where things quietly receded. The twins noticed everything. They always did. Mila sensed the subtle shift in her father, the way his energy pulled back even as his body stayed present. Rowan saw the hesitation in Clara's eyes, the familiar tenning that came from bracing for distance. Unlike the adults, the girls didn't interpret fear as a signal to stop. To them, it was simply something to be acknowledged and moved through. They didn't intervene with words or gestures this time. Their steadiness was quieter, more resolute. They stayed where they were, continuing the conversation as if nothing fragile were at risk. Their calm carried a message without spelling it out. This moment didn't need to be rushed or abandoned. It just needed to be held. Inside Evan, the conflict sharpened. Part of him wanted to retreat, to politely disengage before expectations formed. That part was well practiced, confident in its ability to keep pain at a manageable distance. But another part, smaller and less certain, resisted. It recognized that stepping back now wouldn't be protection, it would be repetition. He had spent years avoiding moments like this, and while avoidance had kept him standing, it had also kept him unchanged. He looked at his daughters, at the ease with which they navigated emotional uncertainty. They weren't reckless, and they weren't naive. They were brave in a way that didn't deny fear but refused to let it decide. Evan realized that they had learned this from watching him stay through hardship, from seeing resilience modeled not as perfection, but as persistence. If he stepped back now, what would that teach them about hope? Clara felt the pause stretch and wondered if this was where she should withdraw gracefully. Experience told her to protect herself, to leave with dignity before disappointment set in. Yet something about the twins' presence, about their quiet confidence, made her hesitate. They didn't look like children, waiting for an adult to fix things. They looked like witnesses, trusting that the adults involved could choose differently. Evan made a small decision that felt larger than it was. He stayed emotionally present. He didn't fill the silence with nervous words or excuses. He didn't retreat into neutrality. He met Clara's gaze again, this time without immediately looking away. The vulnerability of that simple act surprised him. It felt less like exposure, and more like honesty. Avoidance loosened its hold, replaced by a tentative openness. Evan didn't promise anything, not to himself and not to anyone else. He simply allowed the moment to continue without preemptively ending it. The fear didn't vanish, but it no longer dictated his movement. For the first time, he recognized that courage didn't require certainty, it required willingness. Clara sensed the shift and felt her own defenses soften in response. She didn't assume meaning or future, but she allowed herself to remain present without bracing. That alone felt like progress. Being chosen, even in this small way, felt different than being tolerated. It carried a warmth that settled deeper than surface kindness. The café returned fully to Evan's awareness, but the moment held. He understood then that staying didn't mean committing to outcomes he couldn't predict. It meant not letting old fears rewrite new experiences before they had a chance to become something else. That realization landed quietly but firmly, changing how he understood the tension he'd been feeling all along. One realization changes how he sees the moment. Sometimes growth begins the moment avoidance ends. Evan noticed it not as a scion but as an absence. The instinct to look away simply didn't arrive. When Clara met his eyes again, he stayed there, grounded in the moment rather than bracing for it. It felt unfamiliar, like using a muscle he had kept dormant out of caution, but it didn't feel dangerous. If anything, it felt honest. The room didn't change. The café didn't quiet itself in acknowledgement, yet something fundamental had shifted inside him. Clara felt the change just as clearly. For so long, isolation had been the lens through which she interpreted every interaction. a filter that told her what to expect before anything had a chance to unfold. Now, that lens cracked. She wasn't scanning for withdrawal or second-guessing her place at the table. She was present, fully and without apology. Being looked at without being assessed allowed her to exist without shrinking, and the relief of that realization settled gently into her chest. Evan sensed his daughters watching, not with curiosity, but with quiet affirmation. Mila and Rowan weren't studying him for approval. They were witnessing something align. This was compassion modeled without instruction, connection demonstrated without performance. He had spent years teaching them resilience through consistency and care, but here they were teaching him something equally important, that courage could be soft, that staying didn't always mean enduring alone. The distance he once relied on had disguised itself as strength, but now he saw how thin that disguise had been. Distance had kept him functional, yes, but it had also kept parts of him untouched. As he remained open, he felt something loosen that he hadn't known was still bound. He didn't feel exposed in the way fear predicted. He felt lighter, as if choosing not to hide created space rather than risk. Clara was no longer defined by the quiet ache of being overlooked. In this shared moment, she wasn't someone on the edge hoping to be invited in. She was already here, already included. The twins' easy presence and Evan's steady attention created a sense of belonging that didn't demand explanation. It didn't erase her past experiences of invisibility, but it reframed them. They became chapters, not conclusions. The girls continued the conversation naturally, their laughter and observations weaving the group together without effort. They didn't manage the interaction, they trusted it. Evan noticed how they responded to Clara not as an outsider, but as a person whose thoughts mattered. Watching them, he understood that found family didn't require time or shared history at first. It required recognition. The rest could come later, or not at all, and still be meaningful. Hope, once something Evan guarded against, took on a different shape. It wasn't loud or insistent. It didn't demand promises or guarantees. It simply existed as a possibility, gentle and present. He realized he had confused hope with expectation for years, rejecting both to avoid pain. Now he saw that hope could coexist with uncertainty, that it could be an act of openness rather than a gamble. Clara felt that hope too, though she didn't name it. It showed up as ease in her shoulders, as a willingness to linger rather than prepare an exit. She didn't imagine futures or attach meaning beyond the moment. She allowed the connection to be what it was, trusting that being chosen, even briefly, mattered. That trust felt like a quiet redemption, proof that her openness hadn't been misplaced after all. Evan met her eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation, no calculation, just acknowledgement. He wasn't stepping into a role or offering something he couldn't sustain. He was simply allowing connection to exist without prematurely limiting it. In that choice, he felt aligned with the man he wanted his daughters to know, not just the one who had kept everything running. The café felt unchanged and yet entirely different. The shared table no longer represented forced proximity but chosen presence. Evan understood that what began as avoidance had turned into something else entirely, not because he was pushed, but because he allowed himself to stop pulling away. What began as avoidance becomes connection. Sometimes a single moment of courage changes everything. If this story stayed with you, let it stay with others too. Stories like this only grow when they're shared, when quiet moments are valued, and when people choose to stay instead of scroll away. If you believe kindness still matters, you already know what to do. And here's the question that lingers. If you were sitting at that table, would you have looked away or would you have stayed?